So hopefully you have your Bibles open to Mark chapter 7. We're going to be looking at that passage that Diane just read. You know, I love stories of people who have overcome incredible obstacles in life and have gone on to achieve great things. I don't know about you, but they encourage me, they inspire me, they challenge me as I look at what they were able to do in light of great obstacles. And there are so many examples that can be shared. And I just want to share a couple with you as we begin this morning, and just to get our thinking going about obstacles and overcoming them in our life. One example is that of Helen Keller. I think we're all familiar with Helen Keller. She entered this world as a normal, healthy child, but at the age of 18 months, she was suddenly stricken with a very mysterious illness that robbed her of sight and sound. And as a result, she became a very angry child, and she manifested that. She was uncontrollable at times because she was misunderstood. I mean, she had a mind, and she knew things, but she was not able to communicate those things. Well, her life changed, though, at the age of 7 when she was introduced to Anne Sullivan, who became her lifelong friend and teacher. Anne began to teach blind and deaf Helen Keller how to speak when she allowed Helen to feel the position of her tongue and lips as she made a sound. And over time, as a result, Helen Keller was soon able to learn how to speak. And of course, as a result, we all know she went on to become a world-famous speaker and author, as well as an advocate for people with disabilities. Another person who faced great obstacles in life and was able to overcome them was a person by the name of Wilma Rudolph. Wilma was born prematurely in 1940 and struggled with numerous health issues as a child, including pneumonia and scarlet fever and polio, which left her with a partially paralyzed leg. Well, she refused to be held back, and she started working with a physical therapist to overcome her disability. And in time, she discovered that she loved running, so much so that she went on to represent the United States in the 1960 Olympic Games in Rome, Italy, where she won not one, not two, but 3 gold medals in the track and field events, including the coveted 100-meter race. The final person that I would just begin with this morning as one who overcame great obstacles is the person by the name of Louis Zamperini, whose life story is written about in the best-selling book Unbroken, which was also made into a movie. Louis was a World War II bombardier whose plane was shot down while searching for another missing plane. Well, he survived the crash and the subsequent 47 days in the life raft. Can you imagine that out there in the middle of the ocean? Well, he survived that, but his ordeal and struggle for survival had only just begun because he was captured by the Japanese and sent to a POW camp where one guard in particular tortured him almost to death. Amazingly, he survived 2 years as a prisoner of war before being released when the war ended. Well, finally free, he went home, and he had a new obstacle that he had to deal with in life, and that was dealing with the trauma of the time that he spent as a prisoner of war in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. And of course, we know that struggle to be today PTSD. At first, he almost succumbed to it. He had nightmares where he would wake up screaming from reliving the torture that he went through. He also began abusing alcohol, and soon his marriage began to crumble and almost led to divorce. But things changed when his wife convinced him to go to a Billy Graham crusade where he received Christ and a new lease on life. Well, his newfound faith gave him the strength to tackle another obstacle, which was that of forgiving those guards that almost killed him during the war. But he was able to do so. And having overcome these various mental and emotional obstacles in his life, Louis Zamperini went on to become a very successful, inspirational speaker, as well as starting a camp for troubled youth. Well, this morning our journey through the Gospel of Mark brings us to a passage in chapter 7 where we are introduced to an unnamed woman who faced several obstacles in her attempt to get help from Jesus for her daughter who was demonized. Now, others facing a similar situation probably would have given up, but not this woman. No obstacle was going to stop her in her quest to get some help for her daughter. And in the end, her daughter is healed. But more importantly, Jesus publicly praises this woman for her faith and rewards her for her faith. And Matthew's account is the one that tells us about this. So what I want to do, and that is, I want us to turn back to Matthew's account of this same event, because we see him sharing some things that are important. So turn back, if you would please, just to Matthew chapter 15 and follow along as I read verses 21 through 28. This gives us Matthew's perspective of what took place. And this is what he writes. And Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. I'm in Matthew 15, verse 21. And behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and begged him, saying, "Send her away, for she is crying out after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered, "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire." And her daughter was healed instantly. Now, as you can see, Matthew provides us some additional details to this story that are important for us to see. And I want to incorporate some of them as we work through this passage and as we get Mark's now perspective of what transpired, which I remind you probably came through the Apostle Peter. So turn back, if you would, to our passage in Mark chapter 7, verses 24 through 30. Now, the big picture is simply this. A woman is desperately seeking help from Jesus for her daughter who is tormented by a demon. And as we've seen Jesus do numerous times, in the end, he responds to this woman's cry and he heals her daughter. That's the big picture. But something much more significant is going on, and that is what we have here is the fleshing out of a faith that overcomes obstacles. One that Jesus commends and rewards in the end. So let's take a closer look at this passage. It begins with Jesus' unexpected retreat. Jesus' unexpected retreat. Now, up until this time, Jesus has spent the majority of his time ministering publicly and traveling through the Jewish territories of Galilee and Judea, seeking crowds and publicly presenting himself as the long-awaited Jewish Messiah, as well as the fact that he is God in the flesh. Furthermore, as Jesus ministered, he was laying down the standards to be met in order to identify with him and his kingdom. And finally, he was proving the legitimacy of his claims by working countless miracles. Yet in spite of the undeniable proof Jesus offers in defense of the truth of his claims and teaching, what we see is that Jesus is rejected. There are two great moments of rejection which bring this phase of Jesus' ministry to a close. The first moment of rejection took place when the Pharisees committed the unpardonable sin. That is, when they attributed satanic power to Jesus' miracles. This demonstrated to Jesus that they were so thoroughly and entirely committed to unbelief that there was no hope that they were going to change and believe him and accept him and his deity. That's the first moment of rejection, when the Pharisees committed the unpardonable sin. The second moment of rejection took place after the feeding of the 5,000, when the Jewish crowds refused the spiritual standards that were laid down by Jesus. And you read of this in John's Gospel, chapter 6. The whole chapter is devoted to that. They refused those standards, and more than that, we read there that they tried to take Jesus by force and make him their king, which of course he resisted. So starting here now in Mark chapter 7 and verse 24, Jesus' emphasis and tactics changed dramatically. We read first, notice, and from there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. Now what do we know about this particular region? Well, first, geographically, it was located on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, some 35 miles northwest of Capernaum in Galilee, where Jesus had been ministering extensively up until this time. So what this means is that Jesus took his disciples outside of Israel proper to the chief cities of the Gentile region of Sciro-Phoenicia, an area which is now part of modern-day southern Lebanon. And then second, spiritually, the region of Tyre and Sidon was notorious for its wholesale activity with respect to idolatry. In fact, Jezebel, you probably recognize that name, Jezebel, the wicked wife of King Ahab of Israel, came from this particular region. If you recall, she was the one who promoted the worship of the false god Baal. And she was the one who tried to chase down and put to death that godly prophet by the name of Elijah. So Jesus takes his disciples to a location that represented the most extreme expression of paganism and idolatry, both actually and symbolically, that a Jew would expect to encounter. Now you can imagine what the disciples were thinking when Jesus told them that they were going to the region of Tyre and Sidon. Hey guys, we're going to leave now. We're leaving Galilee. We're heading up toward the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. We're going to that region of Tyre and Sidon. And I suspect probably what happened is that these guys looked at one another and began to talk among themselves. And then finally they pushed someone forward to be their spokesperson, probably Peter, who said, "Lord, I don't know if this is a good idea. I mean, this is not a place where we need to be hanging out. After all, we're Jews and they're Gentiles. Are you sure about this, Lord?" Well, Jesus was sure about this change of location. So why did he take his disciples to this unexpected place? Verse 24 tells us, look at it. And he entered a house and did not want anyone to know. So Jesus went there not to minister publicly to the crowds as before, but the opposite, to retreat from them. And the reason why he wanted to do this is because he wanted time alone with the 12. He wanted to privately instruct the disciples, the 12. You see, the shadow of the cross loomed ever larger now for Jesus. We're probably only 6 months away from the cross. And the Lord did not want his coming death to find his disciples totally unprepared. So beginning here in Mark's gospel, there's a change in the focus of Jesus' ministry. He had been traveling throughout the land of the Jews. Now he begins to move in non-Jewish territories, starting here in the region of Tyre and Sidon. He'd been performing miracles freely. Now he seeks to avoid miracles in the attempt to escape attention. And he had been seeking crowds. Now Jesus is seeking privacy. But as the end of verse 24 reveals, Jesus' desire for less attention and more privacy did not happen. Why? Because it says, notice, yet he could not be hidden. Jesus could not be hidden. Again, let me remind you where Jesus is now. He's not in Israel, among his people. He's in pagan, Gentile territory. Yet amazingly, even in this location, Jesus could not be hidden. As was so often the case, Jesus' fame preceded him, even among the Gentiles. Now, why is this? Well, I think the answer is given to us because of what we read back in Mark chapter 3, verses 7 and 8. Just flip back to that passage. Mark chapter 3, verses 7 and 8. Notice what Mark writes. This is, shortly after the startup of Jesus' public ministry. We read this. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, that is the Sea of Galilee. And a great crowd followed from Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem and Idumea and from beyond the Jordan and from, notice, around Tyre and Sidon. When the great crowd heard all that he was doing, they came to him. I suspect what happened is that those from Tyre and Sidon went back home and began to spread the news, the good news about Jesus, his words of wisdom, his deeds of mercy, his loving compassion. No wonder he could not be hidden. Everyone was talking about Jesus. You know, what was true of Jesus back then is still true of him today. No matter how much people tried to hide Jesus, he cannot be hidden, even in the darkest places of the world. And let me say also, by way of application, that like Jesus, a true follower of his cannot be hidden. The way you live your life as a Christian should impress those who know you best that you belong to Jesus and that he has made all the difference in your life. Now, with Jesus in the area, it didn't take long for someone to seek him out. And this brings us now to verses 25 and 26, where we read of a woman's urgent request. Mark writes the following: "But immediately a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an unclean spirit heard of him, and came and fell down at his feet. Now this woman was a Gentile, a Sciro-phonetician by birth. And she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter." Now Matthew's parallel account, what we read just a couple minutes ago, tells us exactly what she said to Jesus. This is what Matthew writes: "And behold, a Canaanite woman from the region came out and was crying, 'Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon.'" So as soon as the word got out as to the location of the house where Jesus and his disciples were staying, there's a knock at the door. And standing outside was this unnamed woman who's described by Mark and Matthew as being, first of all, a Gentile woman, meaning she's not Jewish. Second, she's a Sciro-phonetician woman by birth, meaning she was born in that particular area, the region of Tyre and Sidon. Matthew tells us, third of all, that she's a Canaanite woman, meaning she was a descendant of the ancient race of people that were bitter enemies with Israel. A race of people that Israel tried to exterminate at one time without success. And then lastly, of course, she was a woman whose child was severely oppressed by a demon. I can't imagine the agony this mother was experiencing because of the severely demonized condition of her daughter. I mean, it's so foreign to us, isn't it? To think about that. A child, and we don't know how old this child was. It was a baby, if it was a young child, older, we just don't know. But I can't imagine the agony that she was experiencing. But was her daughter foaming at the mouth? I mean, that's the sign of a demonized person. Was she inflicting bodily harm upon herself and others? That's another sign. Was she uncontrollable as a crazed animal? That's still another sign. We're not told, but what we do know is that this woman was so desperate for help that she sought out Jesus. Now, what drew her to Jesus? Again, I refer you back to that passage in Mark chapter 3. I suspect that those from this region who witnessed firsthand the ministry and miracles of Jesus came back. And maybe one of them was one of her friends. And they began to tell her about Jesus and what he could do for the child. And so when word got out that Jesus was in the area, that's all she needed to hear. But this woman's background created for her some serious obstacles to overcome. For one thing, she was a woman. She was a woman in a society dominated by men, and being a Gentile woman was even worse. Plus, her nationality was a strike against her. She lived in a region that was known for its idolatry, for its unbelief. And the fact that she had a daughter who was demon-possessed surely caused her to be looked down upon by others. Yes, there were several obstacles in her way, and more to come as we will see, but to her credit, she overcame every single one of them. She came to Jesus in faith, and in the end, He is going to commend her for it. He's going to reward her for it. Notice with me her faith on display. First, upon hearing that Jesus was now physically close by, Mark tells us that she went, and here's that word that's repeated again and again in Mark, she went what? Immediately to Jesus. Yes, this woman wisely recognized that the only source of help for her daughter's condition was found in Christ alone, and so she went straight to Him for help. Let me ask you, who do you turn to when suddenly you are confronted with a crisis? Who's the first person you turn to? Is it Jesus? You know, great faith knows that beyond our own resources is the source of all power and provision, who is Christ Himself. Notice too that once this woman was in His presence, she fell down at His feet, meaning she deliberately prostrated herself before the Lord. This showing to the world and to Jesus most of all, true humility, another mark of great faith. You know, I'm reminded here of what Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5 through 7. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that in the proper time He may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on Him, because He cares for you. Well, we see furthermore that this woman's faith was displayed when she addressed Jesus by His proper titles. According to Matthew, she refers to Him as Lord as well as Son of David. This reveals she had more than a superficial understanding of who Jesus was. She must have heard from others about the true identity of Jesus, and in His presence, she addressed Him as she reverently believed Him to be in her heart. We see also from Mark's account that upon coming to Jesus, this mother begged the Lord for His help. Matthew tells us that she was crying to the Lord for help. Now, both verbs in the original Greek convey the ideas of persistence and perseverance. In other words, this woman kept begging, she kept crying, she kept asking, she kept doing this over and over again. This persistent resolve not to give up clearly reveals she had some degree of faith or belief that Jesus had the authority and power over demons. And then finally, this woman's faith is also seen in her repentant attitude. Matthew tells us that her very first words to Jesus were, "Have mercy on me." Yes, this woman was persistent in her cry for help, but before this came her cry for mercy. She came to Jesus not demanding, she came to Jesus pleading for His mercy. She knew only mercy could bring help, and so she sought God's mercy as a repentant sinner. So from the moment she came to Jesus, this woman displayed a remarkable faith that He could and would heal her daughter. Now you would think that knowing the heart of Jesus, as we have seen it displayed thus far in the Gospel of Mark, that the next thing that takes place is that He heals the daughter and she goes home and they live happily ever after, right? That's what you would expect. But that's not what we see. Instead, what follows is Jesus' unusual response. First, according to Matthew, we see there that Jesus gave no response. Matthew writes, but He did not answer her a word. Think about that. He did not answer her a word. Here she is, doing all these things, pleading, crying out to Him. And He doesn't answer her anything initially. Well, that seems rude, doesn't it? I think it does. Maybe even cruel. Again, here's this woman standing before Jesus, pleading for her child, and He doesn't say a thing. Was He looking straight at her? I don't know. Was He looking away as she's doing this? I don't know. Sometimes the silent treatment can be the worst response a person can receive. Then adding insult to injury, Matthew tells us, and His disciples came and begged Him, saying, "Send her away, for she's crying after us." Now, their response was rude. It was cruel. Plus, it was lacking in compassion. Either they were saying, Jesus, do something. She's bugging us. Or, Jesus, would you just get rid of this woman? Whatever they meant, the Lord's disciples once again revealed they were clueless when it came to understanding Jesus and his ways. So why was Jesus' initial response one of silence? It was because he was testing her faith. He was trying to grow her faith. As one commentator put it, Jesus' silence was the silence of love. And this is so true because his intention was not to destroy her faith, but to develop her faith. And as we will see shortly, she passed the test with flying colors. Now, when the Lord finally does speak, his words appear to be words of rejection. Matthew tells us in his account that Jesus begins by saying, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, these words were probably directed to his disciples. But of course, the woman's there listening to this. Jesus' point is that he's reminding the 12 that his calling was to be Israel's Messiah. So to bypass the Jews in order to bless Gentiles would be inappropriate. Yes, Jesus had come to die for the sins of the whole world, but his primary ministry at the present time was still to win Israel first. Now, did this new obstacle stop this woman? Not at all. This is because true faith perseveres. That's what we see with this woman. Matthew tells us at this time, and I quote now, she came and began to bow down before him, saying, Lord, help me. So undeterred, she presses on in her quest to get help for her daughter. The great evangelist D.L. Moody observed concerning this woman that she offered, and I'm quoting him now, offered a prayer of 3 links connecting earth with heaven. Lord, help me. Those are probably the most important words we can utter to the Lord. Lord, help me. And I hope you do that throughout your day. I know I do personally. Lord, I need you. Help me as I live my daily life. Now, what happens next is that Jesus finally speaks to this woman using an illustration from everyday life that reinforces the same basic truth he had just shared with his disciples about being sent to the lost sheep of Israel. Mark tells us in verse 27, notice, and he said to her, let the children be fed first, for it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Now, at face value, the illustration that Jesus shares with this woman is not difficult to understand, is it? When it comes to feeding children, no parent would ever take the food off of their plate and give it to a dog. You just don't do that. Children always come before dogs. You don't feed your dog at the expense of your children. But of course, this illustration had a far deeper meaning. The children represent the Jewish people, and the dogs represent Gentiles. So Jesus was telling her the same truth he told his disciples, that his first priority of ministry was to Jews. Now please understand here that the Greeks had 2 different words for dogs. 2 different words. One referred to the wild and sometimes vicious dogs that ran in packs, out in the street. And those dogs would feed off any garbage that they would find. And we don't see that too much here in America. And I've been privileged to be able to travel to the South Pacific on several occasions to do some ministry. And on the island of Fiji and the island of Tonga where I have been, you see this very thing. You see packs of wild dogs. Some of them, they have no eye, they got half a leg, and they're running together, and they're feeding off the garbage that is found in the street. Well, the other term referred to a little dog or puppy, that fluffy, lovely little thing that you would love to hold in your arms. And that one usually was a household pet, and they did back then have a household pet as a dog. It's similar to the pet dogs that we have in our homes today. Well, in this case, Jesus used the kinder term to refer to Gentiles. The household puppy term, not the other one, not the street scavenger, mongrel, vicious term, the one that most Jews use to refer to Gentiles. They used it as a term of reproach. Jesus didn't use that one. But even with Jesus doing this, one could easily understand this woman getting upset with him and viewing his words as an insult. But amazingly, she did not. Instead, they had the opposite effect on her. She saw in his words a glimmer of hope. And so she seized on them, and in a remarkable display of faith, this woman offers a unique reply. And we read of it in verse 28. Notice how she begins. She doesn't get angry and say to Jesus, "Why are you calling me a dog?" She doesn't do that. Instead, her first words to him are what? "Yes, Lord." This revealing that she's in total agreement with what Jesus just said to her. Meaning she understood that the children in his illustration represented the Jews. She also accepted Jesus' use of the term dogs for Gentiles, which of course would include her. And finally, she accepted the reality that the Jews had first dibs on the benefits of Christ's earthly ministry. But what makes this woman's reply to Jesus even more unique is that after stating her agreement with his illustration, she uses it as a final appeal. She makes one final appeal to Jesus. Notice what she says in the rest of verse 28. "Yes, Lord." And then she says this, "Yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." So borrowing from the Lord's illustration, this woman makes the observation that after children have been fed, it was customary to let, the dogs eat any crumbs that fell on the ground. We do that with our dog. Our wired hair dachshund by the name of Brenly is not allowed in the kitchen while we're eating. She has to be in a chair that's in the living room right next to our kitchen. But as soon as we are done, guess what? She has free reign. And she comes in, and of course, as any dog would, she's all over the kitchen looking for anything that dropped on the floor. It's hers. Diane calls her our canine vacuum cleaner. And she indeed is that. So in this woman's final appeal to Jesus, she essentially places herself within his illustration and acknowledges she has no claim to what the children are served, meaning she doesn't want to take what is not rightfully hers. Instead, all she's requesting of Jesus is whatever crumbs of his mercy, of his healing power, he could spare for her daughter. That's all she was asking for. She's not asking for a T-bone steak from Jesus. She's just asking for crumbs, nothing more. So how does Jesus respond to this woman's final plea? First of all, he restores her daughter back to health. We see this in verses 29 and 30, our final verses for this morning. And he said to her, "For this statement, you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. Can you imagine the joyful reunion that took place between mother and daughter later on that day? I mean, just think about it, moms. Your daughter is no longer possessed. No longer would she be tormented by a demon. She is now undeniably restored back to health. But Jesus does one more thing for this woman. He publicly commends her for her faith. Matthew is the one that tells us this. He reports Jesus saying before all to hear, this is what he said to this woman, "Oh woman, great is your faith." How many times do you hear Jesus saying that in the gospel accounts? Only a couple times. Only a couple. And he did it for this woman. Back in Genesis 32, the story is told of Jacob wrestling all night with an angel who took on the form of a man. It's an interesting story, and I love it. It's one of my favorite from the Old Testament, especially from Genesis. And we read in that passage that in the morning the angel said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." So they were wrestling all night, Jacob and this angel, wrestling all night. Can you imagine that? You remember Jacob's response when the angel said, "Let me go"? He said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Oh, I love that. I love that. Well, this woman in the New Testament is the New Testament version of Jacob, who essentially said the same thing to Jesus. I will not let you go, Jesus, unless you bless me. And of course, he did. Why? Because she wore him down? No, not at all. It was because of her faith in the face of numerous obstacles that Jesus responded to this woman's cry for help. And he healed her daughter. You know, pastor and author Warren Wiersbe, one of my favorite authors, he just recently went to be with the Lord. He used to say the Christian life is not a playground, it's a battleground. The Christian life is not a playground, it's a battleground. And experience tells us he is absolutely right. The Christian life is one of many ups and downs with obstacles around every turn. And those obstacles, of course, often slow us down. And if we are not careful, they have the potential to hinder us from moving forward in our faith walk with Jesus. But as we have seen this morning, obstacles aren't necessarily a bad thing. God wants to use them to grow our faith and teach us how to depend on him in our daily lives. Remember, God never promised us an easy life, but he did promise that he will always be there with us. Always. He will never, ever forsake us. So what does a faith that overcomes obstacles look like? Well, first of all, it's a dependent faith that trusts in Christ and him alone. It's a dependent faith. Second, it's a persistent faith that takes Christ at his word and will not let go no matter the obstacles. And then third of all, it's a humble faith that depends upon Christ's goodness and not our goodness. Oh, may God grant each one of us this kind of a faith that overcomes any obstacles that are thrown our way because it is dependent, it is persistent, it is humble. Let's close in prayer.